Towards the very end of the 4th century, one of history's greatest civilizations stood at a crossroads. The Western Roman Empire, once an unshakable force that had dominated Europe, North Africa, and parts of West Asia for over 1,000 years, found itself ensnared in a web of circumstances that would ultimately lead to its demise. This wasn't the fall of some minor territorial kingdom, but rather the collapse of an organized superpower that had defined the entire known world for centuries. The sheer scale of this collapse would shape the trajectory of human history for the next millennium, and in understanding it, we must grapple with one of the most profound transformations ever to befall civilization itself. To understand this monumental event, we must look not at a single catastrophic moment, but rather at a series of converging forces that worked together to undermine the very foundations upon which Rome had built its empire. The process was gradual yet inexorable, with each weakness compounding the others until the great structure simply could no longer bear its own weight. Indeed, the historian Edward Gibbon would later observe that Rome's decline was the natural and inevitable effect of immoderate greatness, suggesting that prosperity itself ripened the very principles of decay from within. The seeds of Rome's destruction were planted long before barbarians ever breached its walls. In fact, the most dangerous enemies Rome would face were often not those attacking from without, but rather the rot that was consuming it from within. The process began in earnest during what historians have come to call the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of such profound political turbulence that it nearly shattered the empire entirely during the 230s to 284 period. During this crisis, the imperial throne became essentially a prize to be seized by whoever commanded the strongest army, rather than a position of legitimate inheritance or democratic selection. Between the years 235 and 284, the position of emperor became so unstable and contested that more than 50 individuals claimed the purple at various times. Some ruled for mere months before being murdered by their own soldiers or overthrown by rivals. The situation grew so chaotic that for a time, the empire effectively had multiple emperors ruling simultaneously in different regions, each claiming legitimate authority while fighting one another for supremacy. This political chaos at the highest levels of government had consequences that cascaded downward through every level of the administrative system. Morale amongst the bureaucracy collapsed, as officials no longer knew whether their emperor would still be alive and in power weeks or months from now. The loyalty of the legions became increasingly uncertain, as soldiers came to see the throne not as the seat of legitimate authority, but merely as a prize to be seized by whichever general could offer the most plunder or advancement. Military units that were supposed to be defending the borders against external enemies were instead being marched hither and thither by ambitious commanders seeking to seize or maintain power at Rome's center. The political chaos combined with and accelerated a catastrophic economic decline that had been developing for centuries. The Roman economy, which had been essentially stagnant since the 3rd century, faced mounting pressures from every conceivable direction. One of the most insidious of these was the deliberate debasement of the imperial currency. Roman emperors, desperate for funds to pay their armies and maintain their courts, hit upon the ruinous strategy of reducing the precious metal content of Roman coins while keeping their nominal value the same. This practice, which essentially amounts to counterfeiting on a massive scale, destroyed confidence in Roman currency. The silver denarius, once containing 90% silver at the height of the empire, saw its silver content reduced to just 5% by the time of the 3rd century. Ordinary people who received these coins knew they were being cheated, and trust in the currency evaporated. The result was rampant inflation that squeezed the population mercilessly. Merchants and farmers, unwilling to accept payment in worthless coins, began to hoard precious metals or simply refused to conduct commerce at all. Trade, which had been one of the great sources of Rome's wealth, began to stagnate. The intricate web of long-distance commercial networks that connected the empire together started to fray. Manufacturers in one province could no longer rely on distant markets for their goods, and consumers in cities could no longer depend on distant suppliers to provide them with the goods they needed. The taxation system, already onerous, became even more unbearable as the government attempted to collect more and more currency to fund its military and administrative operations. The burden fell most heavily upon the provincial populations, whose productive efforts generated the wealth that the empire extracted through taxation. As living standards declined and agricultural productivity fell, the tax base itself shrank, creating a vicious cycle that seemed impossible to break. People had less to tax, so the government raised tax rates further, which caused the economy to decline further, which caused tax revenues to decline further still. The very size of the empire, which had once been the source of its power and prestige, became an increasingly serious liability. The empire at its greatest extent stretched from Scotland in the north to the Sahara Desert in the south, and from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to Mesopotamia in the east. Governing such a vast territory with the communication and transportation technologies available in the ancient world was extraordinarily difficult. A message from Rome to the frontier provinces might take weeks or months to arrive, meaning that by the time orders from the capital reached provincial governors, circumstances might have changed entirely. The Emperor Diocletian, ruling from 284 to 305, recognized this fundamental problem with crystal clarity and made the momentous decision to attempt a radical restructuring of imperial governance. He divided the empire into 4 parts, establishing what became known as the Tetrarchy, with himself as supreme ruler, but with 3 subordinate emperors ruling the other regions. The theory was that this division would make governance more efficient and more responsive to local conditions. Diocletian himself ruled the eastern portion of the empire from Nicomedia in Bithynia, making himself the supreme authority while allowing subordinate emperors to handle day-to-day governance in their regions. The Tetrarchy was meant to be a temporary administrative innovation, but it hardened into something far more permanent and, ultimately, far more destructive. When Constantine the Great came to power, he dissolved the formal Tetrarchy, but his response was to create something even more significant. In the year 330, Constantine took the unprecedented step of establishing an entirely new capital city at Byzantium on the Bosporus, renaming it Constantinople in his own honor. This new capital was positioned perfectly to serve as the center of a new Eastern Empire, leaving Rome itself as the capital of the West. Constantine's intentions were never entirely clear from historical sources. Did he intend to split the empire permanently? Or was he simply attempting to manage it from a more central location that was closer to the threatened frontiers? What is clear is that his decision to establish Constantinople and shift the center of imperial gravity eastward had enormous consequences. The Greek-speaking, wealthier and more stable eastern provinces increasingly developed their own identity and interests separate from the Latin-speaking West. The two halves of what nominally remained a unified empire began to pursue different foreign policies, developed different cultural outlooks, and competed for resources and influence rather than cooperating with one another. At the very heart of Rome's power had always been its legendary military machine. The Roman legions had been the instrument through which Rome had conquered its empire and maintained its dominion. But by the time of the 4th century, the legions themselves were undergoing a profound and troubling transformation that many historians view as symptomatic of the empire's deeper decline. The problem was demographic in nature. The Italian homeland and the older provinces that had traditionally provided soldiers for the legions were no longer producing enough healthy young men to fill the ranks. Some of this was due to plague and disease. Some of it was due to the economic hardships that reduced living standards and nutrition. Some of it was due to the simple fact that as living standards declined, families saw fewer incentives to produce large numbers of children. Whatever the cause, Rome found itself unable to raise armies of sufficient size from its own population to defend all of its borders and maintain its power. Unable to gather enough soldiers from the Roman citizenry itself, emperors were forced to recruit increasingly from outside the empire's traditional heartland. Germanic peoples, who had lived beyond the Rhine and Danube frontiers for centuries, began to be recruited en masse into the Roman armies. Goths, Franks, Vandals, and other Germanic tribes found that military service offered opportunities for advancement, plunder, and status that were unavailable in their home territories. By the late 4th century, soldiers and even officers of barbarian origin had become commonplace in the Roman armies. This transformation had profound consequences that were not always apparent at the time. These Germanic soldiers of fortune proved fierce and capable warriors, certainly. Many of them were excellent fighters, with skills honed in constant warfare along the frontiers, but they harbored only tenuous loyalty to the empire they served. Their primary loyalty was often to their own commander, who might be a Roman general or might be a barbarian chieftain who had managed to gain a commission in the Roman army. Many of the Germanic officers who filled the ranks of Roman commanders increasingly used their military positions as stepping stones to seize power for themselves, turning against their Roman employers when the opportunity presented itself. Indeed, there is a dark irony in Rome's military history that would prove tragically consequential. Many of the very barbarians who would eventually invade, conquer, and settle in Roman territory had gained their military education, training, and expertise while serving in the Roman legions. They had learned Roman military tactics, Roman military organization, and Roman methods of siege warfare. They understood how Roman fortifications were designed and where their vulnerabilities lay. When they eventually turned against Rome, they did so with knowledge and capabilities that Rome itself had given them. The imperial government itself, which had once been the envy of the ancient world for its sophistication and efficiency, began to deteriorate markedly during the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. Political amateurs increasingly came to dominate the imperial court, replacing the experienced administrators who had built and maintained the system. Army generals seized the throne with alarming frequency, and with them came incompetent courtiers and hangers-on who knew nothing of administration but everything about personal advancement through patronage. Corruption became endemic throughout the system. Officials at every level began to view their positions primarily as opportunities for personal enrichment rather than as responsibilities to the empire. Tax collectors would extract far more from the population than was necessary, pocketing the excess. Provincial governors would establish corrupt arrangements with local elites, sharing extracted wealth in exchange for their cooperation in tax collection. Military commanders would embezzle funds intended for the support of their troops. The Senate, that ancient body which had once constrained imperial power through law and tradition, had long since ceased to be a meaningful check on imperial authority. During the Republic, the Senate had been powerful enough to restrain even the greatest of military commanders. But by the time of the later empire, the Senate had become little more than a rubber stamp for whatever strongman held military authority. Senators no longer debated policy in any meaningful way. They simply approved whatever the reigning emperor or dominant general decreed. The competence of emperors themselves declined markedly during this period. The empire was ruled at various times by men of genuine ability and vision, certainly, but also by mediocrities, incompetence, and outright mental cases. The succession system, which had never been firmly established on hereditary principles, meant that the position of emperor often went to whoever could seize it by force rather than to the person most capable of wielding it. An ambitious general with a loyal army might seize the throne, only to be overthrown a few years later by another ambitious general with a similarly loyal army. The result was that governance became increasingly haphazard and reactive rather than strategic and planned. Recent scholarship has illuminated a factor that earlier historians often overlooked or underestimated: the profound role that climate change and disease played in hastening the empire's decline. In one of history's most compelling ironies, the Western Roman Empire's fall may have been sealed not by the plans of ambitious barbarian warlords, but by bacteria, viruses, and changes in weather patterns that no amount of military power could resist. For much of the early Common Era, southern Europe and the Mediterranean basin enjoyed a period of warm, wet, and stable climatic conditions. This climate, which climate historians have termed the Roman climatic optimum, had been perfectly suited to the agricultural expansion that an expanding empire required. The warm temperatures allowed for the cultivation of crops in regions that would have been marginal in cooler periods. The reliable rainfall supported high agricultural yields. This climate formed the material foundation upon which the economic prosperity of the Roman Empire rested. But between roughly the years 200 and 600, this period of climatic stability came to an abrupt and catastrophic end. Climate variability returned with a vengeance, bringing with it droughts, cold periods, and agricultural instability that struck at the heart of an empire whose very survival depended fundamentally on surplus agricultural production. Historians studying tree rings and ice cores have been able to reconstruct these ancient climate patterns with remarkable precision, and the record shows a clear deterioration in climate conditions during the late imperial period. The disruption was severe enough that it is reflected in the written historical records. Contemporary observers noted unusually cold winters and failed harvests. Roman soldiers stationed on the northern frontier reported unusual hardships from cold weather. Archaeological evidence shows that the pattern of human settlement shifted as regions became less suitable for agriculture. Populations contracted in areas that had previously been densely settled, and marginal lands that had been brought under cultivation during the warmer period were abandoned. The climatic situation deteriorated catastrophically during the mid-6th century, when the world experienced what may have been the most severe volcanic eruption of the entire millennium. In the year 535 or 536, a volcanic eruption so tremendous occurred that it ejected massive quantities of ash and particulates into the upper atmosphere. This eruption was so vast in scale that it is believed to have been visible across the entire globe, and it triggered what is known as the Late Antique Little Ice Age. The effects were immediate, severe, and catastrophic. Volcanic ash circling the Earth blocked sunlight, causing a dramatic reduction in the amount of solar radiation reaching the Earth's surface. Global temperatures dropped by approximately 2 degrees Celsius, which may not sound like much until one realizes that this represented the greatest temperature decline in 2,000 years. In Europe and the Mediterranean, the effects were devastating. The contemporary Byzantine historian Procopius, writing in the 6th century, recorded the phenomenon, "Then it became dark in a terrible way, for the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year." Contemporary observers across the world recorded similar observations. In China, historians noted the darkness. In Central America, Maya records speak of the sun being hidden. The darkness lasted for months in some regions, and the dimness persisted for years. The consequences for agriculture were immediate and severe. Mass crop failures followed as plants could not photosynthesize effectively in the reduced sunlight. Temperatures fell below the threshold needed for many crops to grow at all. The following year, 539 or 540, saw another major volcanic eruption that compounded the problem. The combination created what historians have termed a perfect storm of agricultural collapse. Without sufficient food production, populations began to starve. Governments lost the tax revenue that had depended on successful harvests. Armies could not be fed or sustained. The Byzantine Empire, still strong and relatively wealthy, managed to survive this catastrophe and even to maintain its military campaigns, but only barely. The already weakened kingdoms of the Western Mediterranean found themselves pushed beyond their breaking point. Environmental historians have argued, with considerable force, that this climatic catastrophe may have been the final blow that transformed gradual decline into rapid collapse. Even before the volcanic eruptions of the 6th century, the late antique world had been ravaged by pandemic diseases that decimated populations and undermined the economic and military capacity of the empire. The empire experienced 3 major pandemics during the period of decline, each one striking at times when the empire was already weakened and least able to cope with the disruption. The first was the Antonine Plague, which struck in the years 165 to 180. This disease, believed to have been either smallpox or measles, spread rapidly through the empire via the extensive trade networks that connected far-flung regions. The plague was particularly deadly because the populations of the Mediterranean had never encountered such a disease before and possessed no immunity to it. The death toll was staggering, with contemporary observers reporting that entire villages were depopulated and that many cities lost a significant portion of their population. The second major pandemic was the Cyprian Plague, named after the Christian bishop Cyprian, who wrote vivid descriptions of it, which struck in the years 250 to 260. This plague was even more deadly than the Antonine Plague in many regions, striking at a time when the empire was already reeling from the political chaos of the crisis of the 3rd century. The combination of civil war, economic disruption, and pandemic disease created a perfect storm of devastation. Contemporary sources suggest that some regions lost a majority of their population. The third and most significant pandemic was the Justinianic Plague, which struck in the year 541 and would continue to recur in waves for centuries afterward. This plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same organism responsible for the Black Death of medieval Europe, was perhaps the deadliest disease event in human history up to that time. It swept through the Mediterranean and beyond, killing an estimated 25 to 50 million people, perhaps a quarter or more of the world's population at that time. The Justinianic Plague struck the Byzantine Empire particularly hard, killing possibly 1 million people in Constantinople alone. The population of the Byzantine Empire was reduced by somewhere between 30 to 50%. The disruption was so severe that the empire's cities and infrastructure could not be maintained. Even more significantly for our purposes, the plague struck at a time when the Byzantine Emperor Justinian was attempting to reconquer the Western Empire, and the plague's devastation undermined his ability to maintain those reconquests. These pandemics operated through mechanisms both direct and indirect. Directly, they killed enormous numbers of people, reducing the population available for agriculture, industry, and military service. Indirectly, they created social chaos and disruption that further undermined economic systems and governmental function. Entire occupational classes could be wiped out, disrupting specialized crafts and trades. The trauma of disease was so severe that it seems to have affected social psychology, making people less willing to engage in long-distance trade or to participate in the complex economic activities that civilization depended upon. Yet even as Rome crumbled from within, external pressure mounted relentlessly from beyond its borders. For centuries, Rome had managed to contain or control the Germanic peoples living across the Rhine and Danube frontiers. But by the early 4th century and beyond, this delicate balance was failing catastrophically. The barbarian tribes themselves had undergone profound and significant changes during the centuries of contact with Rome, and by the late 4th century, they presented a fundamentally different threat than they had in earlier centuries. The Germanic peoples had developed improved agricultural techniques that allowed their populations to increase significantly. They had moved beyond the simple raiding economies of earlier centuries, where young warriors would attack Roman settlements to acquire plunder, to develop more complex societies with stronger organizational capabilities. They had established regularized succession systems, administrative structures, and diplomatic protocols. By the late 4th century, they were no longer scattered bands of warriors operating independently, but rather organized peoples with recognized leadership structures, diplomatic ambitions, and the capacity to field large, coordinated military forces. The Goths, in particular, had undergone a remarkable transformation. Beginning in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the Goths had moved from their homeland in what is now Scandinavia and eastern Germany southward toward the Black Sea and the Danube frontier. They established themselves in large numbers in the regions north of the Danube, and they began to develop a more settled agricultural lifestyle. They established kingdoms with kings recognized by their people, they developed legal traditions, and they began to accumulate wealth and resources. By the 4th century, the Goths had split into two main groups: the Visigoths, who controlled territory west of the Danube and between the Black Sea and the Balkans, and the Ostrogoths, who controlled territory further east. Both groups were now numerous enough and organized enough that they could not simply be brushed aside by Roman military force. They had the capability to negotiate with Rome as something approaching equals, and they had the capacity to wage serious war if negotiations failed. But even as Rome struggled to manage the Germanic peoples on its borders, new threats were emerging from further east that would prove even more destabilizing. The Huns, a nomadic people from Central Asia whose origins remain somewhat mysterious to historians, began to move westward in enormous numbers during the late 4th century. These were not civilized, settled peoples like the Goths, but rather nomadic warriors who relied on their skill at horsemanship and their mastery of archery to dominate their enemies. The Huns, under their leader Attila, would eventually become the most powerful threat that either the Eastern or Western Roman Empire would face in their final centuries. But before Attila came to power, the initial pressure of Hun migrations was already beginning to destabilize the entire region north of the Danube. The arrival of Hunnic peoples in Central Europe set off a chain reaction, with various Germanic peoples being pushed westward and southward as they fled from Hun pressure. This cascading migration pattern was perhaps the single most significant factor in bringing about the final collapse of the Western Roman Empire. As Hunnic pressure forced Germanic peoples to move, those peoples in turn pressed against the Roman borders. The Goths, squeezed between Hun pressure from the east and the Roman frontier to the south, began to migrate in larger and larger numbers. Other Germanic peoples, also fleeing from Hun pressure, moved toward Roman territory. What had been a manageable situation of occasional barbarian raids and small-scale border conflicts transformed into a massive refugee and migration crisis of unprecedented scale. The pivotal moment that shattered forever the myth of Roman military invincibility came at the Battle of Adrianople in the year 378. The Visigoths, a Gothic people numbering perhaps 100,000 or more, including women, children, and the elderly as well as warriors, had become increasingly desperate as pressures from the Huns drove them toward Roman territory. Their king, Fritigern, petitioned the Roman Emperor Valens for permission to cross the Danube and settle within Roman territory. Valens, perhaps foolishly, agreed. The Visigoths were allowed to cross the Danube frontier and settle as foederati, a Latin word meaning federates or allies. The arrangement was that the Goths would provide military service to Rome in exchange for land to settle on and provisions to feed their people. This seemed like a reasonable arrangement, and Valens believed he had both solved the problem of Hunnic pressure and acquired a large body of soldiers for his army. But the Roman government catastrophically mishandled the situation. Corrupt officials who were responsible for providing the food and supplies promised to the Goths cheated them outrageously. The provisions were insufficient to feed the massive Gothic population that had crossed into Roman territory. Desperate for food, the Goths were reduced to conditions of near starvation. Some accounts suggest that the situation became so dire that desperate Gothic families were forced to trade their children into slavery in exchange for dog meat with which to feed themselves. The oppression and mistreatment became unbearable, and the Goths rose up in open revolt. Emperor Valens marched out at the head of a large Roman army to crush what he regarded as an uprising of rebellious foederati. The two armies met near the city of Adrianople in what would prove to be one of the most decisive battles in human history. The battle itself is described in ancient sources as a tremendous clash of arms, but what is clear is that the Roman army was completely and utterly annihilated. The Eastern Roman Emperor Valens himself was killed in the fighting, along with perhaps 2/3 of his army. It was a catastrophic defeat, the worst Roman military disaster since the 3rd century. The psychological impact of Adrianople cannot be overstated. If the legendary Roman legions could be defeated, if the emperor himself could fall to barbarian spears, then surely the empire was not invincible. This realization spread throughout the Mediterranean world like wildfire. Romans who had grown up believing in the unquestionable superiority of Roman military might were forced to confront the possibility that perhaps Rome could be defeated after all. The shattered morale from this defeat would never fully recover in the Western Empire. The myth of Roman superiority was broken, and once broken, it could never be fully repaired. The peace that followed Adrianople proved fragile and short-lived. For a time, Roman generals managed to contain the Visigothic threat and negotiate arrangements that seemed to stabilize the situation. But as the 4th century transitioned into the 5th, the situation continued to deteriorate. Roman authority in the western provinces, already weakened by political infighting and civil war, continued to decline. Ambitious generals fought for control of the imperial throne, and their struggles drained resources away from the frontier defense. In the year 410, the Visigothic king Alaric, frustrated by the meager terms that Rome was offering to his people and angered by broken promises and continued mistreatment, made the momentous decision to march directly on Rome itself. For nearly 800 years, no foreign enemy had dared to attack the city of Rome itself. The city was protected by legend and myth as much as by any physical fortifications. Romans everywhere believed that Rome was eternal, that it could not fall, that the gods themselves protected the eternal city. Alaric's army surrounded the city and demanded that the Roman government negotiate and provide them with the lands and provisions they had been promised. The Roman government, now controlled by the Comes Flavius Stilicho, a military strongman of Germanic descent, attempted to resist, but the Roman army was too weak and too divided to mount an effective defense. The city, which had not fallen to a foreign enemy since the days of the Gauls nearly 700 years before, found itself completely undefended. In a move that shocked the civilized world, Alaric's army breached the walls and for 3 days plundered what had been the greatest city in the world. The Visigoths looted temples, burned buildings, and pillaged everything in their path, leaving trails of destruction that shocked observers throughout the Mediterranean. Contemporary accounts speak of rape, murder, and the systematic destruction of the accumulated wealth of centuries. For the first time in nearly a millennium, the city of Rome was in the hands of someone other than the Romans themselves. The psychological impact of the sack of Rome in 410 was perhaps even more devastating than the military impact. If Rome itself could be sacked, if the eternal city could be conquered by barbarians, then what did that say about the future? Yet somehow, remarkably, the Western Roman Empire survived this catastrophic event. Roman generals managed to rebuild their military forces and push back the immediate threat posed by the Visigoths. Alaric himself died not long after the sack of Rome, and his successors were eventually persuaded to settle in what is now southern France and Spain, establishing what would become the Visigothic kingdom. But the damage was done. The myth of Rome's invincibility had been shattered irreparably, and barbarian peoples everywhere began to recognize that the Western Empire was no longer the superpower it had once been. If the Visigoths could sack Rome and survive to tell the tale, what was to stop other barbarian groups from attempting similar ventures? The respite granted by the settlement of the Visigoths proved tragically brief. In the year 429, a Germanic people called the Vandals who had been displaced by Hunnic pressure and had previously been operating in southern Gaul and Spain, crossed from Spain to North Africa. They brought with them a reputation as particularly fierce and destructive raiders, and this reputation proved well-founded. The loss of North Africa was perhaps the single most devastating blow to the Western Roman Empire's economic viability. For centuries, North Africa, particularly the province of Egypt and the regions around Carthage, had been the breadbasket of the Western Empire. The grain that was harvested in the fertile lands around the Nile Delta and in North African provinces was shipped by merchant vessels across the Mediterranean to feed the massive populations of Rome and other Western cities. Without this steady supply of food, the great cities of the West could not be sustained. The Vandals, under their king Gaiseric, established themselves as a territorial power in North Africa and began to control the grain supply. They used their new position of power to extract wealth and resources from the region, and they used their control of the grain supply as a bargaining chip in negotiations with the Roman government. By controlling the food supply, Gaiseric held the Western Roman Empire by the throat. The cities of the West, deprived of food, began to face starvation. Populations declined dramatically as people abandoned the cities and attempted to survive in the countryside. The great urban civilization that Rome had built over centuries began to collapse. Moreover, the Vandals were not content with merely controlling North Africa. They established themselves as a naval power, building a formidable fleet of ships that allowed them to raid the Mediterranean with near impunity. Christian pilgrim ships traveling to the Holy Land were attacked and robbed. Merchant vessels were seized. Roman shipping, which had once dominated Mediterranean trade, began to decline precipitously as merchants found it too dangerous to venture onto the seas. The economic strangling of the Western Empire tightened with each passing year. In the year 455, less than 50 years after the first sack of Rome by the Visigoths, the Vandals returned and sacked Rome for the second time. Led by King Gaiseric himself, the Vandal fleet sailed into the mouth of the Tiber River and landed an army that plundered the city for 2 weeks. Unlike Alaric's Visigoths, who had sacked the city relatively quickly, the Vandals took their time, systematically looting everything of value. They ransacked temples, stripped precious metals from buildings, and even removed the copper roof from the great temple of Jupiter. The shock of seeing Rome attacked for the second time in less than 50 years was perhaps even greater than the first sacking. While the Vandals were establishing their kingdom in North Africa, other Germanic peoples were carving out their own territories across the Western Empire. The Franks and Burgundians pushed into Gaul and began to establish kingdoms that would eventually become the foundations of medieval France. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes crossed from the Jutland Peninsula in what is now Denmark and occupied Britain, eventually giving their name to the land they conquered, Angle Land, or England. In what is now Spain, the Visigoths, who had initially sacked Rome, eventually settled and established what would become one of the most lasting and successful of the barbarian kingdoms. Other Germanic peoples settled in other regions. The Ostrogoths, cousins of the Visigoths who had initially served as Roman allies, grew increasingly ambitious and eventually conquered Italy itself, establishing a powerful kingdom under their king Theodoric. It was as though the entire continent was in motion, with waves of migration and conquest sweeping across the former imperial territories. The empire, already weakened by internal problems and environmental stress, simply could not marshal the military or economic resources to resist all these simultaneous pressures. The great unified political structure that had characterized Rome for 1,000 years was being dismantled piece by piece, territory by territory, as various barbarian peoples established their own independent kingdoms. The fundamental problem facing the Western Roman Empire in its final decades was that it had divided into 2 separate and increasingly competitive political entities, each pursuing its own interests at the expense of the other. The division that Constantine had created for administrative convenience in the year 330 had hardened into a true separation of interests and priorities. The Eastern Roman Empire, which historians came to call the Byzantine Empire, was powerful, wealthy, and increasingly stable. It controlled the richest provinces, including Egypt with its grain supplies, the wealthy cities of the Levant, and Greece. Constantinople, the great capital city on the Bosporus, was protected by formidable walls, commanded the sea lanes, and served as the center of a sophisticated, bureaucratic, and military machine. The Byzantine Empire had the resources to maintain a large, professional military force, to invest in infrastructure, and to support a sophisticated intellectual and artistic culture. The Western Roman Empire, by contrast, was increasingly poor, isolated, and weak. It had lost the wealthy provinces of North Africa to the Vandals. Its trade networks had been disrupted by the chaos of the barbarian invasions. Its population was declining due to war, disease, and the general collapse of urban civilization. It lacked the sophisticated administrative infrastructure that the East maintained. The great cities of the West, once centers of learning and culture, were being depopulated and falling into ruin. Most critically, the Western Roman Empire could not count on the Eastern Roman Empire to provide military support when the greatest crises came. The Byzantine emperors had their own problems to deal with. They faced threats from Persia in the east. They were dealing with religious controversies that threatened the stability of their empire. They faced their own barbarian pressures on their northern frontiers. When the Western Empire appealed for help, the Byzantine emperors often had no resources to spare, and even when they did, they were reluctant to commit them to what seemed like a losing cause. By the middle of the 5th century, much of the Western Empire had already fallen under the control of various barbarian kingdoms, or was dominated by ambitious military strongmen who cared little for the legitimacy of the imperial office. The situation in Italy, where the capital city of Rome itself was located, had become particularly dire. The Western Empire had become so weak that it could not defend its own heartland. Government in the Western Empire during this final period lurched from crisis to crisis, with different military strongmen competing for power and installing puppet emperors whom they could control and manipulate. These strongmen, many of them of Germanic origin or descent, wielded the real power. The emperor nominally held supreme authority, but in practice, the emperor was often little more than a figurehead, a symbol of legitimacy that the true power holders needed to justify their authority. The actual authority of the Western Roman emperor had become almost entirely fictional by the late 5th century. Real power lay with the Germanic generals and their barbarian mercenaries. The emperor might issue edicts, but these edicts would be obeyed only if the dominant general chose to enforce them. The emperor might attempt to gather tax revenue, but this could only be done if the dominant general permitted it. The emperor might attempt to appoint officials, but these officials could be removed if the general opposed them. This situation created a kind of twilight for the imperial institution. The emperors of the late 5th century were pathetic figures, often young men, sometimes mere adolescents, who were installed and removed by military strongmen like puppets on strings. The empire that had once been ruled by emperors of genuine power and ability was now ruled by shadows and phantoms, figures who bore the title of emperor but who wielded none of the actual power that the title implied. By the year 476, the situation in Italy had reached a point of complete collapse. The Western Roman Empire still nominally existed, but its territory had been reduced to little more than Italy and a few scattered regions. The government was controlled by a military strongman named Orestes, a comes or count, who wielded the real power while maintaining an emperor as a figurehead. The current emperor was a young man named Romulus Augustulus, who bore one of the most famous names in Roman history. Romulus Augustulus was the son of Orestes, and his father had installed him as emperor, presumably hoping to keep power within his own family. But Orestes had made a critical error. A Germanic general named Odoacer, who commanded a force of barbarian mercenaries, demanded land to settle his followers in Italy. This was a common request by the time, as various barbarian groups expected to be provided with agricultural land in the regions they protected and conquered. Orestes, for reasons that historians are not entirely certain about, refused Odoacer's demand. Perhaps he thought he could resist. Perhaps he believed his military forces were strong enough to defeat Odoacer. Whatever the reason, his refusal proved to be a fatal miscalculation. Odoacer, faced with what he regarded as an unacceptable rejection of his demands, took direct action. He marched on Ravenna, the capital of the Western Roman Empire at that time, and defeated the Roman forces defending it. The military forces under Orestes' command proved insufficient to resist Odoacer's mercenaries. In the fighting, Orestes himself was captured and executed. With Orestes dead and his forces defeated, there was no one to defend the young emperor. Odoacer then forced Romulus Augustulus to abdicate. The young emperor, described as pathetic and ineffectual in historical sources, offered no resistance. He was deposed without bloodshed, simply removed from office and sent into exile. He was, after all, merely a figurehead anyway, and his removal changed very little in terms of the actual distribution of power. The real power had always rested with Orestes, and now it rested with Odoacer instead. Odoacer then did something remarkable. He did not proclaim himself emperor. Instead, he declared himself king of Italy and sent the imperial insignia, the physical symbols of imperial authority, to the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno in Constantinople. He was, in effect, acknowledging that the Eastern Roman Empire was the true continuation of the Roman imperial tradition, and that he was merely a regional king operating within the shadow of that greater authority. He promised to rule Italy in the name of the Eastern Emperor, and to acknowledge Zeno's nominal supremacy. The Roman Senate, that ancient body that once had ruled the world and bent emperors to its will, was consulted on this arrangement. The senators, having watched the empire decay around them for generations, accepted the situation without significant protest. There was no great drama, no final stand by the defenders of Roman civilization. Rather, there was a kind of weary acceptance that things had simply changed, that the old order had passed, and that a new order was emerging. It was in that moment, in the year 476, that scholars and historians would later mark the official end of the Western Roman Empire. The year 476 became the date that would echo through history as the fall of Rome, and yet to those living through it, the event seemed almost anticlimactic, almost unworthy of the historical significance that would later be assigned to it. The real power of the empire had already slipped away decades, perhaps even centuries earlier. The government had already lost control of its territories. The army had already become essentially uncontrollable. What Odoacer's deposition of Romulus Augustulus represented was less a sudden catastrophe and more the final formality in a long process of decline that had been happening for generations. Indeed, many people living at the time probably did not even realize that they had witnessed the end of an empire. Life in the year 476 did not feel dramatically different from life in the year 475. People still spoke Latin. The Christian Church still held sway. The great monuments of Rome still stood, though increasingly in disrepair. The basic patterns of daily life continued much as they had. The transformation from empire to barbarian kingdoms did not happen in a single dramatic moment, but rather as a gradual fading of one reality into another. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus marked the beginning of an entirely new epoch in European history. Yet it is crucial to understand that what emerged from the rubble of the Western Roman Empire was not simple chaos and darkness, but rather a complex transformation. The political system changed fundamentally, certainly. Imperial authority was replaced by regional kingdoms. Unified governmental structures gave way to fragmented local power. The sophisticated military systems of Rome became impossible to maintain. Yet here is where a paradox emerges that reveals the complexity of this transformation and challenges simplistic narratives of decline and fall. Despite their reputation as destructive outsiders bringing an end to civilization, many of these barbarian rulers were actually deeply invested in preserving and continuing Roman culture and institutions. They understood that legitimacy came from maintaining Roman forms, from presenting themselves as continuators of Roman civilization rather than as destroyers of it. Odoacer himself is an excellent example of this paradox. After deposing Romulus Augustulus, Odoacer did not dismantle the Roman system wholesale. Rather, he attempted to maintain it. He kept the Roman Senate in operation, though its actual power had already been reduced to nothing. He continued to issue coins bearing the image of the Eastern Roman Emperor, acknowledging the nominal supremacy of Constantinople. He preserved the Roman administrative systems, maintaining the bureaucratic structure that the Romans had developed. Roman aristocrats continued to hold positions of authority in his government, working alongside Germanic warriors and administrators. Odoacer's kingdom of Italy was stable and reasonably well governed by the standards of the time. He was not interested in plundering Rome or reducing it to ruin. Rather, he wanted to rule it successfully and to extract the resources it generated for his own maintenance and that of his followers. He stabilized the situation, ended the wars and chaos that had characterized the preceding decades, and allowed the population to settle into a new normal. The Ostrogoths, who would soon dominate much of Italy under their king Theodoric, took this process of cultural continuity even further. Theodoric was perhaps the most remarkable of the barbarian kings of the post-Roman period. He was a Gothic king, born and raised among the Germanic peoples, yet he was also profoundly influenced by Roman civilization. Theodoric had actually been raised as a hostage in Constantinople as a boy, and had been educated in Roman ways and learning. He spoke Greek and understood Roman administration, law, and culture in ways that most barbarian kings did not. When Theodoric came to power and eventually conquered Italy from Odoacer, he ruled from Ravenna, the capital that the Romans themselves had established. He maintained the Roman Senate, not as a figurehead institution, but as something approaching genuine advisory body. He preserved the complex Roman bureaucratic system and invested heavily in maintaining and repairing the public buildings and monuments of Rome that had begun to fall into serious disrepair. Theodoric understood that his legitimacy as a ruler rested on his ability to maintain order and to preserve the civilizational achievements of Rome. Indeed, Theodoric saw himself as the true heir to Rome, and in some ways he was right. His kingdom was more Roman, in terms of its institutions and administration, than many of the governments that had called themselves Roman in the decades immediately preceding the fall. Theodoric issued coins bearing the titles and images of Roman emperors. He maintained the postal system. He invested in infrastructure. He attempted to keep the tax system functioning, though the economic resources available were far more limited than they had been in earlier centuries. He established a court that mimicked imperial court etiquette and practice. The Visigoths, who controlled Spain and southern Gaul, similarly attempted to maintain Roman law and customs. They developed one of the most advanced legal codes of their time, the Liber Iudiciorum, which combined Germanic and Roman legal traditions and provided a legal framework far more sophisticated than what most of medieval Europe would possess for centuries. The Visigothic kingdom, though less wealthy and less sophisticated than the Ostrogothic kingdom, nevertheless attempted to present itself as continuing Roman civilization under new leadership. The Vandals, who controlled North Africa, were perhaps somewhat of an exception to this pattern of cultural continuity. Their control of the wealthy grain-producing provinces of North Africa isolated the remaining Western territories from the food supplies they desperately needed. This contributed to a sharp and sustained decline in living standards and the depopulation of many Western cities. The Vandals were also noted for their persecution of the Catholic Church, favoring instead the Arian form of Christianity that had been brought to them by earlier Gothic missionaries. Yet even the Vandals, in their own way, attempted to maintain elements of Roman governance, issuing coins and maintaining some administrative structures. The Franks, who had settled in Gaul north of the Loire River, gradually emerged as the most powerful and enduring of the barbarian kingdoms. The Frankish realm would eventually grow to encompass much of Western Europe, and would become the foundation upon which medieval European civilization would be built. Under the Merovingian dynasty, and especially under the remarkable leader Clovis I, who reigned from 481 to 511, the Franks not only preserved Roman institutions but integrated themselves more fully into the Christian world. Clovis was a transformative figure in early medieval European history. He understood that legitimacy in the post-Roman world came from multiple sources. Like the other barbarian kings, he maintained Roman institutions and presented himself as continuing Roman civilization. But he went further. Clovis converted to Christianity, and according to tradition, he did so in a dramatic moment of military crisis when he vowed to accept Christianity if he won a crucial battle. Whether or not this story is strictly historically accurate, Clovis did convert to Catholic Christianity, the form of Christianity practiced in the Roman Empire and by the Pope in Rome. This conversion was extraordinarily significant. Clovis's conversion meant that the Franks, unlike many other barbarian peoples, were adopting the same form of Christianity that Rome had adopted. They were not embracing Arian Christianity, which had been the form brought to many Germanic peoples by earlier Gothic missionaries. Rather, they were adopting the Catholic faith that Rome had embraced and that the Pope represented. This created a natural alliance between the Frankish kings and the Bishop of Rome. The consequences of this alliance would reverberate through centuries of European history. The partnership between the Frankish kings and the Roman Church would become one of the most important developments in the formation of medieval Europe. The Pope, who had lost his position as the spiritual leader of a great empire, found a new protector in the Frankish kings. The Frankish kings, for their part, found legitimacy and religious sanction for their rule through their alignment with the Church. This alliance would eventually lead to the crowning of Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans in the year 800, an event that would symbolize the transition from late antiquity to the medieval period. While the Western Empire fell apart into barbarian kingdoms, the Eastern Roman Empire, which historians came to call the Byzantine Empire, continued to thrive and attempted to maintain its power and influence. The Byzantine emperors still considered themselves the rightful successors to the great empire of Augustus and Caesar, and they considered the barbarian kingdoms of the West to be illegitimate usurpers who held land that rightfully belonged to the empire. Constantinople, the great city that Constantine had founded, protected by formidable walls and controlling the wealth of the Mediterranean, remained a beacon of civilization and power. The Byzantine Empire faced its own serious challenges during this period. It was threatened by the Sassanid Persian Empire to the east, which at various times conquered and attempted to maintain control of Byzantine territories. It faced religious controversies, most notably the Monophysite controversy and later the Iconoclast controversy, that threatened to tear apart the religious and social fabric of the empire. It faced pressure from Germanic peoples and later Turkic peoples on its northern frontiers. But the Byzantine Empire possessed resources and organizational capability that the Western kingdoms lacked. It maintained a professional military force, the legendary cataphract cavalry and elite infantry units that were far superior in organization and training to the armies that the Western kingdoms could field. It maintained a sophisticated bureaucracy that could collect taxes and maintain infrastructure. It controlled the wealthy Mediterranean provinces and could extract the resources it needed to fund its military and administrative operations. In the year 527, the Emperor Justinian came to power at Constantinople. Justinian was an ambitious man with grand vision. He had spent much of his life dreaming of reconquering the lost Western territories and restoring the unified Roman Empire. When he came to power, he had the resources and the opportunity to pursue this dream. He launched a series of military campaigns to reconquer the Mediterranean and to restore Roman authority over the Western barbarian kingdoms. Justinian's greatest general was Belisarius, one of the most successful military commanders of his age. Belisarius led Byzantine armies to a series of remarkable victories. He destroyed the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, reconquering that vital region and once again bringing it under imperial control. He then turned his attention to Italy and launched an invasion aimed at destroying the Ostrogothic kingdom and reconquering the Italian peninsula. The war in Italy between the Byzantine Empire and the Ostrogothic kingdom was one of the longest, most brutal, and most destructive wars of the late antique period. It lasted for nearly 2 decades, from 535 to 554. The fighting was ferocious, with armies marching back and forth across the Italian peninsula, besieging cities, and engaging in pitched battles. Contemporary sources describe the devastation and destruction, the famine that resulted from the warfare, and the death toll that accumulated as the war continued year after year. Belisarius eventually defeated the Ostrogothic kingdom, and for a brief moment it seemed that Justinian's dream of reconquering the West might be achieved. Byzantine authority was restored to Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain. The empire controlled a vast territory stretching from the Danube to North Africa. For a brief historical moment, the Mediterranean was once again an imperial lake. Yet these victories came at a terrible cost. The wars fought between the Byzantines and the Ostrogoths in Italy were so destructive and so prolonged that many historians argue they effectively destroyed the basis for civilized life in Italy. Cities were besieged and damaged. Agricultural land was laid waste. Populations were killed or displaced. The economic resources that had sustained Italy for centuries were exhausted in the fighting. When the Byzantines finally triumphed, they inherited a wasteland rather than a functioning society. Moreover, Justinian's achievements proved unsustainable. The Byzantine Empire, stretched too thin by its reconquest campaigns and weakened by the Justinianic plague that struck in the year 541, could not maintain control of all the western territories it had briefly reacquired. Even as Justinian was attempting to consolidate his conquests, new invaders were emerging from the north. The Lombards, another Germanic people, crossed the Alps and invaded Italy in the year 568, establishing their own kingdom in much of the Italian peninsula. The dream of restoring the unified Roman Empire faded. The Byzantines would continue to maintain a foothold in Italy through the Exarchates of Ravenna, a provincial administration based in the city of Ravenna that represented Byzantine authority. But true reunification of the East and West under imperial authority would never be achieved. The attempt had been made, the resources had been expended, but the goal had proven beyond reach.